What the? What is that thing?
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
Yes, indeed, I'm Gary Anderson, representing the Ohio Knights of Columbus. First of all, people wonder, what is the Knights? I know a lot of you know who we are, but we are the largest Catholic family fraternal service organization in the world. And we're very, very active in the pro-life cause. But I want to thank, first of all, the Life Tech Board, Josh, John, for the invitation to be among these luminaries. I mean, I look around the room. For instance, somebody just came in. I used to be on the board with Ohio Right to Life, along with Denise McCura. Good to see her. Paula. I mean, there's so many stars here in the pro-life movement. Stephanie had to leave, but I'm very, very honored to be here today. And John, one more thing, too. I want to thank you for picking this day for the event and this time, because the Buckeyes have a night game tonight. Bucks. Well, what's up with these Notre Dame colors? Oh, that too. But in my presentation this morning, I'm going to provide a general overview of the plight of Down syndrome children in the U.S. That's going to be past, present, and future. I'll start with a little personal story, because some people have asked me, well, why are you talking about this? Because I'm not a doctor. I'm not an elite. I'm just an ordinary Joe who's been active in the pro-life cause since about, I think, 2006. I was president of Columbus Right to Life for about a year. They got on the Ohio Right to Life board. And the past 6 years, I've been with the Ohio Knights of Columbus as the Culture of Life Activities Director. But the primary focus as my Culture of Life Activities Director position has for me is that I coordinate the activities around the state, all the different pro-life and Culture of Life activities, and we're very, very active, very busy. For instance, the March for Life. Who has noticed at the March for Life in Washington, when you see the hundreds of thousands of people out there, these blue and white Defend Life signs? Seen those? You know who supplied those? Knights of Columbus, correct. So we're very active there. Also, working with abortion healing ministries like Project Rachel. Now in the Columbus area, it's Bethesda Healing Ministry. What a wonderful organization that is. Also, we're very active in Respect Life Month in October. We have an event in March called the Day of the Unborn Child, where we celebrate just that. And that's on the Feast of the Annunciation, of course, March 25th. We're out there 40 Days for Life. Of course, you know, that's starting in another couple of weeks. And I know Stephanie, I think it was Stephanie who mentioned that, yes, indeed, a clinic in Columbus, Complete Health Care for Women, which was the primary site of our 40 Days for Life campaign since '07. The doctor did not renew his license with the Ohio Department of Health. He will no longer do the surgical abortions. For those who doubt, all right, prayerful witness and fasting and just being out there, it works, folks. It works. So 40 Days for Life, it's a very special place in my heart, that particular pro-life endeavor. But there's one more thing that the KFC does too that I want to highlight. It's my favorite. We have a program called the Ultrasound Initiative. How many in this room have heard of the KFC's Ultrasound Initiative program? You will now, because I don't think there's anything better. Since '09, our Supreme Council office in New Haven challenged our councils around the country to provide free ultrasound machines for deserving pregnancy care centers. Deserving meaning they have to be under the watchful eye of a physician, they have to have trained staff, they cannot proselytize against the Catholic Church. After all, the KFC's Catholic. We want to make sure that they're not out there proselytizing. So certain criteria have to be met. Provided they do meet it, our program provides free ultrasound machines. So far, 450, actually over 450 have been provided around the U.S. since '09. 20 in Ohio, 20 right here in Ohio, with 2 to 3 more in progress. The reason why that's such a great endeavor, many of you know, the percentage of women, pregnant women considering an abortion, who have a change of heart and deliver that baby after seeing a sonogram is about 85 to 90%. So I don't think there's a better pro-life program than that. So that's something we're very, very active with as well. But again, our primary focus, though, has to be on abortion. We do many different things in the Culture of Life, but abortion is the primary focus. And we take seriously what St. John Paul II declared, that the primary right is the right to life, the right to be born. So that's our primary culture of life focus. Now there's something else we do as well, which will lead into my program here, my presentation. We're very supportive, in fact, one of the primary supporters of Special Olympics. In fact, Sergeant Shriver, who was the founder back in the 60s, was in a very active Knight of Columbus. And his wife Eunice took over after the passing of Sergeant several years ago. You probably have noticed, if you've seen photos or videos of Special Olympics events, the vast majority of those athletes are Down syndrome children. Would you agree? And just the sheer joy I see on their faces, it harkens back for me to where this began for me. Back in the 1960s, my father was a counselor. He ended up getting a doctorate in special education. At that time, in the 60s, he was working at a facility just outside of Portland, Maine, known as the Pineland Hospital and Training Center. And on Saturday mornings, that was his day just to go and make the rounds in the dormitories. And back then, by the way, they were known as the mentally retarded. They still are in some cases, but that's fallen out of favor, as you know. We're more likely now to call them the intellectually challenged. So Dad would take me around to his rounds, and as an 8-year-old boy from Maine, that was my home up there at the time, it was my first experience with Down syndrome children. Needless to say, I was surprised, actually rather scared. I'd never been exposed to that before. And I saw all different levels, different degrees of the condition, severity of the condition. And I never let Dad forget how when I would misbehave occasionally, he threatened to incarcerate me there. Never let him forget that. But again, I'd never seen people like that before, and they were also known by another term, which was so derogatory. Who knows what it was? Retards? Yeah, but mongoloids. When's the last time you heard Down syndrome people referred to as mongoloids? That started falling out of favor in the 50s and 60s. I haven't heard that for many, many years. But that all made such a lasting impression on me. So fast forward to the present. While I was contemplating a fairly recent Special Olympics event and noticing the participants, the athletes in Special Olympics, suddenly a question came to mind. Where are they? Where are they? So notwithstanding the Special Olympics event, where are they? How often do you see Down syndrome people in public anymore? Rarely. Well, that prodded me to do some investigation, some research. And what I found was deeply disturbing. You see, my brothers and sisters, you don't see many of our Down syndrome brothers and sisters anymore because the vast majority never see the light of day.
Right.
They don't survive the 9 months of pregnancy. The altar of abortion is responsible. And therein is the spark that drives me to make this presentation today. Slide, please. That's the last slide. Back to the beginning. We're going backwards. All the way from the beginning. Okay. Take a quick moment to consider what is the essence of Down syndrome, which clinically is known as trisomy 21. That's what a lot of the doctors in the white coats, the researchers will call it oftentimes. Trisomy 21 is the flavor, if you will, or the variety of Down syndrome that afflicts about 95% of people with the condition. The other 5% fall under either mosaic Down syndrome or translocation. We're not going to go into those today, since 95% are with the trisomy 21. Now, according to the National Institute of Health and Child Health and Human Development, the condition is caused by an error in the division of the cells. Primarily, it's the 21st chromosome does not divide. That's why trisomy 21. So at conception, when the parents' gametes are fusing and forming that individual, that particular unique individual has 3 chromosomes 21. And their entire complement of chromosomes is 47, whereas the rest of us have 46. Now you might think, well, what's one little chromosome do? Well, it's a genetic powerhouse, that extra 21, chromosome 21. What it does, it creates a severe metabolic disturbance. It affects the intellectual ability of the child. There are distinctive physical traits, which we'll talk about briefly coming up here, and often some more or less serious associated medical conditions. Like half of them have some type of congenital heart defect. Gastrointestinal issues, respiratory issues were a major contributor to the very, very short lifespan of people with Down syndrome many years ago. Next slide, please. So some of those traits of Down syndrome, as you'll see here, as put forth by the Centers for Disease Control, CDC down in Atlanta, the IQ level tends to be in the low to moderately low range. The children are slower to speak than a more normal child, a non-Down syndrome child. And then some of those physical traits. They tend to have a flattened face, especially across the bridge of the nose, almond-shaped eyes, it slants up, short neck, small ears, and something that really was apparent to me way back in those days at Pineland Hospital in the mid-60s, they stick their tongues out. Never understood that, but that is one of the traits of Down syndrome. It remains the most common of the chromosomal diseases, or conditions actually, diagnosed in the U.S. today. They figure about 6,000 are born each year, and that's roughly about 1 out of every 700 babies has Down syndrome. Yeah. Now, as far as a history, some of the brief history of Down syndrome. The first time a genetic description was put forth for Down syndrome was done by a Parisian or a French researcher and doctor in 1958, Dr. Jerome Lejeune. And for the first time, with his technique, he was able to actually see chromosomes under the microscope. So it's a fairly recent development. On the right slide here. Yeah. And that all obviously had tremendous benefits for the medical field in general, not just the intellectual disabilities like Down syndrome. Up until that time, the 1950s, 1960s, there were still people believing that Down syndrome was caused by some type of fault of the parents. Oftentimes they felt or they thought that there was a venereal infection link. And many even thought there was a level of contagiousness, that it was contagious. Obviously, we've seen that that's not the case. Now, those children, and I say children because so few of them lived to adulthood, back again in the 60s, up to about the 70s, were almost exclusively institutionalized, just like up at Pineland Hospital. And then gradually, over the past 20, 30 years, you've been seeing them more out there in their homes and in public. The life expectancy for a child or a person with Down syndrome back in the 1920s, 9 years of age. And again, the primary contributor to the early death was the respiratory conditions and diseases they tended to develop. But in the 50s, they had some new antibiotics, new therapies that cured that, plus technology, medical technology, really made a big difference on correcting the heart defects. And the lifespan grew about 3 years to 12 in the late 1940s. But look at the difference since then. It has leapt up to 60 years, up to 60 years, I guess is the next slide. Okay, hold it right there. Nowadays, it's 60 years of age is the life expectancy. Now, with Down syndrome children, many people think that they do not fully develop intellectually and physically. They actually do, but they work on a different schedule. They still tend to attain the same milestones in development, but not at the same pace as non-Down syndrome people. As you can see here on the chart, gross motor skills By the time they can sit, a more normal child or non-Down syndrome, they tend to do that in the 5th to 9th month, whereas children with Down syndrome, it could be as long as 30 months before they master that. Crawling, 6 to 12 months with a normal child, as many as 22 months with a Down syndrome. And walking, 9 to 18 months typical with a normal child. Down syndrome could be as long as 4 years after birth before they can master that. Language, about a year longer on average for the child to mouth his or her first word if he or she has Down syndrome. Social skills, some of the self-help skills as well. Finger feeding themselves, 7 to 14 months for a normal child. It could be as long as 2 years for the Down syndrome child. Using a spoon, as you can see, takes considerably longer because a little bit more fine motor skill there to learn. Bowel control, look at the difference there. Up to 42 months for a normal child, as many as 7 years for a Down syndrome child to master that. So again, they will still accomplish these different steps along the way, these milestones, but at a different pace. Next slide, please. Now, before 2012, the most commonly accepted statistic was 92% termination of Down syndrome babies in utero. That's why you don't see so many out in public anymore. However, there was new research done, a new review of the abortion literature also in 2012, and they showed that the rates actually were dependent more on some other factors. They varied according to certain factors, such as maternal age and race, ethnicity, and gestational age. That played a role in the termination rate. And they came up with a range of approximately 67% to 85%. So that there again you have it. That's why you're not seeing many Down syndrome people in society anymore. They're being terminated in the womb.
I'll be.
It's a holocaust. It's silent in nature.
It sure is.
Next slide, please. Then there were also some hospital-based studies that were done. And the researchers in one publication showed higher termination rates associated with different ages, gestational age. So for children in utero under or 16 weeks or less in gestation, it tended to be higher, 93% termination rate, whereas once they got to 17 weeks and above or beyond, it dropped a little bit to 85%. But you've got to admit, whether the termination rate is 67% on the low end or 93%, there's no arguing that a huge majority of women, once they receive the positive diagnosis of Down syndrome, are still terminating their babies. But that's despite incredible advances. We already talked about some of the medical advances, also some cognitive therapies, which we're not getting into today, but there are tremendous advances there as well that have resulted in that life expectancy going up to 60 now, from 9 and then 12 up to 60 years of age. Society's negative attitudes are still there, although that's beginning to change, but it's even more pronounced, the negative attitudes, with the intellectual disabilities, such as people with Down syndrome. It's created a throwaway mentality.
Right.
Where if they don't meet our standards, terminate them. Eugenics. But these babies nowadays can live happy, fulfilling lives with the current technology. Next slide, please. There's a doctor researcher in Massachusetts at Mass General Hospital, Dr. Brian Scottco. He completed his research in 2011, and these statistics he came up with are pretty mind-boggling. I mean, they're great. He surveyed people with Down syndrome, their parents, and also siblings, ages 9 to 11. Siblings ages 9 to 11. 99% of the Down syndrome people are happy with their lives. 99%. And 97% of them like who they are, their self-identity. So who says these are less than human beings?
Society. Right.
Society, absolutely.
They're goofed up.
Yeah. The parents, 99% of them said they love their child with Down syndrome. How about the siblings, ages 9 to 11? 97% of them said they loved their sibling with Down syndrome. And by the way, I mentioned the institutions. Many of these people were in institutions way back. Much of that was due to shame. Families were ashamed and embarrassed when they had Down syndrome children. But nowadays, that statistic, as you can see there, is only about 5% who feel some embarrassment with having had a Down syndrome child. Next slide, please. And despite these statistics, and the fact that families living with Down syndrome and that the individuals themselves are reporting great satisfaction and happiness in their lives, they're still being terminated in these obscene numbers. And I'm trying to remember who mentioned it earlier. I think it was Dr. Kunith. Disability, or maybe Stephanie, disability selective abortion is what this is all about, is what's causing this.
Right.
These rates of termination are occurring after a positive diagnosis of Down syndrome. So there's a huge disconnect, and many people believe, and I tend to be among them, that it's not only society's prevailing negativity towards intellectual disabilities and specifically towards Down syndrome children, but maybe it's the way the doctors are delivering the diagnosis. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And in many reports, according to many reports, the vast majority of doctors into the 90s are strongly encouraging women diagnosed with Down syndrome to do the compassionate thing.
You're right.
Compassion, there it is. And Stephanie touched on something. In fact, I've got to admit, Dr. Kunith and Stephanie, thanks for setting up a large part of my presentations today. Next slide, please. There it is. Wrongful birth. There is such a thing as wrongful birth. There has been a decision rendered. There has been an award made, not here in Ohio, but back in 2011, there was a set of parents in Oregon who had prenatal testing done on the mother, and the team of doctors delivered a negative diagnosis. In other words, negative for Down syndrome. So they had the baby. Uh-oh. Then they went after the doctors. Wrongful birth. They told the media, they admitted, had they known, had they received a positive diagnosis, they would have terminated that baby.
Wow.
$2.9 million is the settlement. My opinion is these people, I think, were more economically driven, because the $2.9 million was the estimate that some experts they had consulted with had determined to be the added cost nowadays to raise a Down syndrome child. Well, that's a lot of money. I'm not going to judge them. All I know is the outcome was wrong, but the precedent has been set. I wasn't aware personally that Ohio had enacted a wrongful birth ban, so great news coming from Stephanie earlier today. But that's just a sign of how twisted society's attitudes are towards the Down syndrome babies.
Right. Exactly.
Next slide, please. But there is considerable reason for hope. Lots of newly enacted laws around the country. Lots of great pending legislation. Stephanie touched on some of that earlier today regarding disability selective abortions. In fact, North Dakota, March of 2013, enacted a disability selective abortion ban. Good for them. Their neighbor to the south, and South Dakota, you got to admit, they've been on the front lines with a lot of this cutting-edge anti-abortion legislation for quite some time, or at least attempts at it. Most have been shot down. But South Dakota tried it. Theirs was defeated. However, there's a silver lining to South Dakota's disability selective abortion ban being shot down, because there was another track they were running on as well. They did pass a sex-selective abortion ban. And I was going to mention, as did Dr. Kunith, that we know the problems that creates. Just look across the seas at China and India. They're struggling now with the low birth rates of the women. versus the high populations of men because of this sex-selective abortion. But kudos to South Dakota. They were able to pass that, put it into place. Now Indiana, our neighbor to the west, they tried it. It never, unfortunately, made it out of committee or onto the floor for a vote. At least they attempted that. Now education appears to be one of the key fronts here.
Right.
Again, Stephanie kind of set me up for this. She talked about informed consent. Now I know with this informed crowd here, you're aware of what informed consent is. Simply, these patients, the mother, needs to be given the benefits, informed on the benefits and liabilities, in this case, of delivering a Down syndrome child before that baby is allowed to be terminated. Several states are currently addressing that, informed consent. We have that in place here in Ohio, obviously. But they're also attempting to change the mindset with these informed consent laws. Specifically to Down syndrome babies, the effort is to convince the mother, the family, if you will, to look at that baby with Down syndrome more as just a person living with a disability,
Right.
rather than a person consumed with a disability. Again, the negative versus the positive
Right.
mindset. But that legislation has been passed in 6 states. Similar pending legislation is working its way through state legislatures. And by the way, the disability selective abortion, I believe, is working its way through the Ohio legislature. I wish Stephanie was still here. Paula, is that accurate? Do you know that afoot? I'd heard that that might be the case. Something is pending here in May, introduced in May. I was hoping to ask Stephanie, but she had to leave. Okay, next slide, please. In conclusion, yes, indeed, the attitudes are changing, but there was such a long road to go. But we're making progress. Society is gradually beginning to accept our brothers and sisters with Down syndrome as being deserving of the respect, the dignity, looking at them as contributing full members of society. But education, again, seems to be the key to change those attitudes. The informed consent legislation, another track, that's going to make a big difference as well to advance the cause of one day having those brothers and sisters with the condition embraced, respected, and accorded their rightful dignity as full members of the human family. And that concludes my presentation.
We have a few minutes for questions.